India, China, South Africa. Now, the whole idea of the BRICS and the MINS is well established in development economies. I mean, for developed countries, you talk about the G8, sometimes G7, if you want to take Russia out of it. But again, if you come to the developing blocks, countries that are not in the developed category, which are the big economies? And those five were considered the big economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And then they said, which are the second emerging group? Then they looked at Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey. But we try to say, how are they achieving success with respect to just environmental SDGs? I'll talk shortly that the SDGs are broken into the three different big classes of environmental, social, and governance. But the paper is available if you want to read it. We're happy to share with you. But the story here, and I'll tell you the key finding, is that number one, there is limited attention being paid to those things, which is why we're not tracking as we ought to. And if there's any benefit of an exercise like this as professional accountants, is to start thinking at our organizational level, how do we improve those things? But what is more interesting, not exciting, is that we found what we call impressionistic tendencies. Now, in the theories, you might be familiar with what we call signal theory, where managers signal to the market what their earnings could be through management reports. And that's a way for people to look at your stock prices and price it higher. But the thing with impression management is that it's a bit of a flip of the process. With impression management, what you see in the reporting practices is that a manager might talk very well about something they're doing great about, but completely hide, or talk even slightly about the things that they find challenging. Now, if you look at accountability as stewardship, then you might be questioning whether managers are providing stakeholders with sufficient information to make the decision that matter. Anyway, this is just the reminder that the most critical part of weakness in terms of the SDGs is on SDG 13, which deals with like climate action. There's a lot of reason why that's a problem, and I won't go into that for now. But how do we make sustainability and accountability count? How do we change the narrative? So if I've talked about the problem, what's the solution? And this is what is important. For me, I think the starting point is that as accountants, what we measure matters. Because basically what we measure is what we reward. If you're measuring punctuality at work, you're going to keep a roster or a login time, and you tell every staff, tell me what time you arrive. And that could be the basis to be promoted or to get a bonus. So measuring and managing performance that is tied to accountability is important. So how we start thinking about that, it's something that I would leave us to play with when we get to the next point of brainstorming. And we need to think about how we strengthen the metrics that will link those accountability issues to sustainable outcome. Because accountability that is linked with sustainable practices will drive organizational performance, whether it's public, private, and will deliver impact. Now, impact itself, I sometimes describe it as a complex beast. Sometimes we see the impact definition from what we call the materiality concept. And as accountants, we're familiar with the materiality concept. It's slightly modified when we deal with it from the ESG or the sustainability perspective. Two key thinking exist here. Number one is sometimes we think about materiality as the information that is of significant value for stakeholder decision making. For example, if there is something that has been omitted in the financial statement, then it will not be a true reflection of the activities of the reporting entity. And if a manager puts that out, then any stakeholder that makes a decision out of that may not be properly guided. So that's one way of the materiality concept. Now, in the EU actually released the EU taxonomy and the EU framework around sustainability. And it tends to think about materiality from what we call this concept of double materiality, which is slightly related but a bit different. In double materiality, you're really saying, how is the activity of the organization impacting people outside the organization, positively or negatively, and how is the externalities happening in society affecting the organization? Let's put it simple. If I'm a car manufacturer, my goal is to help people commute from one place to the other. However, the unintended consequences of my production process is that I will be emitting significant greenhouse gas emission. Or the cars I make will have high greenhouse gas emission. That's not the intention I want to create. It's not like, I've never seen any manager sit down in the office and say, let's create the most polluting car. No way. It's an unintended consequence. It was not the intention, but in the production process, that has happened. So one way the organization can explain or be accountable for its impact is to say, this is my carbon footprint. This is how the cars I make can impact society. One way, that's my materiality. Another way is for something happening external to also be impacting the organization. For example, if the organization is operating in an environment that is exposed to natural hazard, like in New Zealand, we have two main risks all the time: earthquakes and cyclones and floods. How many of you have been in an earthquake before? Not a great experience, but we are aware of that. So what we ask managers to say is, what if those natural disasters happen? What is the consequences on your business? Because it means you may be forced to move to a different location. You might also be operating in a textile industry and there are regulations coming and you're forced to sign into, a global accord. That is an impact on your business. A failure to sign to those accords may mean you lose some key players in the market. So we ask managers to think about the scenario of those double materiality, the impact of what you do and the impact of what's happening on society on your business. So, in terms of how we change the tide, I think it's important that we start thinking about how we use accountability, not just for scorecard keeping, just say, okay, we've done this, we've reported. Because we can easily make it a tick box. But we can now start putting real responsibility of how we achieve sustainable outcome. There is a key concept here around whether you're thinking about accountability from two perspectives: accounting-based accountability or accountability-based accounting. Slightly confusing, but the story is simple. Now, accounting-based accountability is just simply saying, I've been told to produce this report, I've produced it. End of matter. But in the accountability-based accounting, you're not just producing the report, you're also taking care of the specific responsibility network interest, your key stakeholders, what they need, and how that will help them manage their decision process. And to me, that is really where we need to start. We need accountability that puts us in a position of responsibility as leaders or managers, and we own up to the realities of how we support our community, whether the investing community, whether the bigger society. That is the first task of being a manager, of being a leader. So in lieu of concluding, in other words, not that I want to conclude as this is the last point, I would rather give a charge as to how we take this forward. I think there is need for corporate leadership that delivers accountability-based accounting. So in that corporate reporting exercise, think about your personal responsibility as to how that is going to make a positive or negative impact on the society, your company, or whoever is using that report. Don't just think about it as just a finance or tick box process. It has to be something that you think, if I am called upon to give stewardship before any committee or competent court of jurisdiction, can I defend this action? Do I think what I am passing to my users meets my accountability obligation and I can stand by it? And with that, we're going to reduce these impressionistic tendencies. So like I said earlier, the impressionistic tendencies is a tendency to overhype your great work and completely ignore the areas that other things are not working, because you want to present a balanced and fair information. In the qualitative characteristics of financial information, we want it to be a fair and what? Full representation of the phenomenon, faithful and true representation of the activities of the entity. So, good governance and transparent corporate behavior, which I think is the key factor in reporting, should create a balance in the way we think about how we report. I want to leave us with a good example because I'm concluding now. Here is a way companies do things that sort of begin to tell me there is impressionistic behavior. Number one, a manager might report that they have actually achieved more profit through making the workplace more efficient. But they don't tell us the consequences of that additional profit to shareholders on the accomplishment of SDG 1. SDG 1 is on reducing poverty. And how do companies contribute to reducing poverty? The United Nations believe that if companies create jobs through SDG 1 and in SDG 8, good working condition, no slave labor, compatible salaries, then you are making profit and actualizing those goals. So that's the nexus. Now, I don't know what is happening here, but what is very typical now in Australia and New Zealand is redundancies. Organizations are shrinking because of, after COVID, we've been hit hard. And I do sympathize with the organization. But you see, the goal is this. If the manager comes at the end of the year to say, we've made more profit for you as shareholders, what they don't tell shareholders is, to make this profit, we have actually sacked 50% of the staff. So we've made profit for a 1% proportion of the population, but we've created more poverty to the society. And it's sort of thinking about that nexus that we begin to see how accountability as a mechanism for providing stewardship also links into sustainable development outcome. There's another second one. Companies can easily say, we've created new jobs. Yes, and I like it. But the problem is, they may not tell us that these jobs do not meet the conditions of SDG 8, which talks about decent work and economic growth. Which means, have you created a decent place for people to, work and live in? One of our PhD students in Victoria University once did a PhD on the Rana Plaza incidents in Bangladesh. I'm sure most people will remember that story. But it's simply a failure of, health and safety and sort of decent work ethics. But of course, profit was being delivered. Jobs were being created. But the problem, the jobs did not meet the conditions of SDG 8. So players in the system will begin to say, well, we make profit, but at what cost? At what detriment? And at whose expense? That's just some few examples. I won't it's just for you to see how practical these things fit into our natural life. So accountability that delivers sustainability outcome must render stewardship for both intended and unintended consequences. Sometimes it's not that companies deliberately want to do wrong things, and I know this because I speak with CEOs. I've just had a very big, focus group with all the CEOs and CFOs of the ports in New Zealand, 12 of them. And no CEO in that conversation ever told me their goal is to go to work to spoil things or to make life harder. No. But it's such that as you do business, you may somehow miss to pay attention to those things and you find cracks on the wall. Accountability